The gate wasn't supposed to close that morning. I remember the exact moment the gravel stopped moving under the tires, like the entire road had just decided to go silent. It was 4:17 a.m. in Willow Creek County, and the only entrance to the entire subdivision was a steel gate sitting on land that technically belonged to me. I stood there with a folded survey map in my hand, watching headlights stack up on the other side of the barrier as confusion started to ripple through the neighborhood. My name is Caleb Weston, and 6 months earlier, I had purchased 7,200 acres of undeveloped land that everyone assumed was irrelevant because it sat outside their manicured world. What they didn't realize was that the only road in and out of Willow Creek Estates crossed a narrow strip of my deed, a detail buried in paperwork no one ever bothered to read. That morning, I finally decided to act on it. No warning signs had been posted by me, no threats made, just a simple closure of a gate that had never legally belonged to them in the first place. I could hear vehicles idling, doors opening, someone shouting that this must be a mistake, but the paperwork in my truck said otherwise, and paperwork does not care about opinions or assumptions, only boundaries and signatures. At that point, the road stopped belonging to them entirely. I just waited for the phone calls to begin, because they always do in cases like this. The first call came in just as I was putting the map back into the truck. A phone rang somewhere deep inside the cluster of cars waiting behind the gate, sharp and impatient in the cold morning air. I did not need to answer it to know what it would be. People always assume something like this is a mistake before they accept that it is intentional. By 4:23 a.m., the second car had pulled closer to the barrier, its headlights washing over the steel frame like it could dissolve the problem if it just looked hard enough. I could see movement inside the driver's seat, a hand gesturing. Someone clearly trying to make sense of why a road they had driven for years was suddenly gone. That was when I saw the first real sign of recognition spreading through them. The moment confusion starts turning into panic. My name is Caleb Weston, and I had spent enough time studying property records to know exactly how long it takes for certainty to collapse when people realize the ground under them is not what they believed. The land behind that gate had always been mine, but for years it had been treated like an invisible passageway, something everyone benefited from but no one acknowledged on paper. That is how assumptions survive in places like Willow Creek Estates. They grow quietly until someone finally checks the truth. I leaned against the hood of my truck, watching the line of vehicles stretch further back as more headlights appeared over the hill. The air smelled like cold metal and damp earth, the kind of quiet that only exists right before systems start to break down. I knew exactly who would speak first. It was never the homeowners. It was always the person who believed they were in charge. And I was right. The call came through again, this time closer, louder, more urgent, carried on a speaker phone from one of the vehicles. A voice demanded the gate be opened immediately, followed by the phrase community access, as if repeating it would override legal boundaries. I did not respond. Instead, I reached into the passenger seat and pulled out the original deed folder, thick with stamped documents and survey diagrams that traced every inch of the land beneath their tires. The ink on those pages did not care about urgency or entitlement. It only cared about ownership. Behind the gate, someone finally stepped out of their car. I could see them pacing now, gesturing toward the locked entrance, trying to assert control over something that had already shifted away from them. That was the moment I understood the real weight of what had just happened. It was not just a closure of a road. It was the exposure of a belief system built on convenience rather than legality. And the longer they stood there, the more obvious it became that nothing about that morning was going to reverse itself. By 4:41 a.m., the line of vehicles had doubled, stretching back beyond the curve of the hill where the streetlights stopped working. Engines idled in place, exhaust hanging low over the asphalt like a suspended question nobody wanted to answer. I could feel the shift happening in real time, the way confusion slowly hardens into anger when people believe their routine has been interrupted without permission. A man in the third car leaned out of his window and shouted that this had to be a malfunction, followed by someone else insisting that the gate must be broken. But nothing about it was broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. My name is Caleb Weston, and I had learned long ago that the hardest part of enforcing a boundary is not drawing it, but watching other people realize it was always there. I glanced down at the folder again, running my fingers across the embossed seal from the county records office. Every page inside confirmed the same thing. The access road they depended on crossed private land that had never been granted an easement. For years, it had existed in a gray space created by assumption rather than documentation. That kind of arrangement works fine until someone decides to read the fine print. Behind the gate, a black sport utility vehicle finally pulled forward and stopped at the front of the line. The driver stepped out, closing the door with more force than necessary, and began walking toward the barrier. I recognized the posture immediately, the kind of confidence people carry when they believe authority belongs to them by default. He stopped several feet from the gate and raised his voice, saying he was speaking on behalf of the Homeowners Association and demanding immediate access restoration. I stayed where I was, letting the silence stretch long enough for the absence of compliance to become noticeable. That is when I saw the second wave of realization spread through the crowd behind him. Not everyone was convinced this was temporary anymore. A few drivers had already pulled out their phones, recording, while others began checking maps, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they had been told for years. I could almost feel the ground beneath their assumptions shifting. The man at the front repeated his demand, this time slower, as if volume was the missing ingredient. I finally responded, not with frustration, but with the same calm I had used when I first reviewed the deed. I told him the access road was never part of their development agreement, and that the property line had not moved just because usage had become habitual. For a moment, there was only the sound of wind moving across open land. Then I saw it, the smallest change in his expression, the first crack in certainty. Behind him, someone in the line called out that they were going to be late for work, and another voice asked how emergency services were supposed to get through. That was when the real pressure started to build, not from me, but from the system they had built their lives around. I looked past them at the empty stretch of land on my side of the gate, knowing exactly how far legal boundaries can reach when they are finally enforced without hesitation. By 5:06 a.m., the situation had stopped feeling like a simple inconvenience to them and started turning into something heavier, something closer to consequence. The line of vehicles behind the gate had grown restless, headlights shifting left and right as drivers began to understand that waiting would not change the outcome. I stayed near the steel barrier, one hand resting on the cold surface, watching how quickly order collapses when access is interrupted without warning. My name is Caleb Weston, and I had seen enough property disputes in county records to recognize the exact stage they were in, the moment where belief in entitlement begins to collide with documented reality. A second representative arrived, this time in a white pickup truck with a laminated badge clipped to his shirt, identifying himself as part of the Homeowners Association board. He did not introduce himself with questions. He started with statements, saying the road was classified as a shared access corridor and that closing it violated community covenants. I let him finish without interruption. People often speak faster when they are unsure whether they are right. Behind him, the first man who had approached earlier stood slightly back now, no longer leading, only observing, as if recalibrating his position in a situation he no longer controlled. I reached into the truck and placed the full deed packet on the hood, spreading it open under the dim light. The pages were worn at the edges, but every stamp, every survey line, every recorded boundary remained clear. I pointed to the section that traced the access road directly across my parcel, then to the absence of any recorded easement granting perpetual use. The silence that followed was different this time. It was not confusion anymore. It was calculation. I could see the board member reading without speaking, his eyes moving slowly across language that did not support the argument he had arrived with. A few cars behind him, someone shut off their engine. Then another. The sound of idling began to fade, replaced by something more uncomfortable, stillness driven by uncertainty rather than compliance. The wind moved across the open land again, carrying dust from the edge of my property toward the gate. I watched as the group shifted positions, no longer unified in direction, but scattered in interpretation of what came next. The man with the badge finally looked up and asked how long this closure was going to last, but the question itself revealed the misunderstanding. It was never about duration. It was about definition. I told him calmly that access was never granted in legal form, only assumed through repeated use, and assumptions do not survive when boundaries are enforced. That was when the first vehicle began to reverse, slowly at first, then with more certainty, turning away from the gate as if the road had never belonged to them in the first place. I did not move as they started to leave, only watched the line dissolve one car at a time into the quiet stretch of county road behind them, realizing that what they had called an entrance was never truly theirs to begin with. The moment the last vehicle disappeared beyond the bend, the road did not feel empty the way it used to. It felt reset, like something in the environment had been rewritten and nobody had fully updated their expectations yet. The wind moved freely across the open stretch of land again, but the silence carried weight now, different from the confusion of minutes earlier. My name is Caleb Weston, and I stayed by the gate longer than necessary, watching dust settle into the tire tracks that were already fading as if they had never belonged there at all. I knew the pause would not last. Situations like this never end with acceptance on the first try. It usually takes resistance before reality is allowed to settle. At 5:32 a.m., my phone started lighting up inside the truck. Unknown numbers first, then repeated attempts from what looked like a coordinated list. I did not answer. Instead, I sat inside the cab and reviewed the same survey documents again, tracing the boundary lines with my finger like repetition could make the truth easier for others to understand. The first official message arrived by email. It was labeled as an urgent notice from the Homeowners Association, written in formal language that tried to convert assumption into authority. They claimed that the access road had been maintained as a shared corridor for decades, and that any obstruction constituted an immediate violation of community rights. I read it twice without changing my expression. There was a pattern I had seen before in county disputes. When documentation fails to support belief, language becomes more forceful to compensate. By 5:47 a.m., a second message arrived, this time copied to a legal representative. It referenced emergency access requirements, suggesting that essential services might be impacted by my decision. That part caught my attention, not because it was accurate, but because it was predictable. I had already verified every recorded easement, every utility mapping, every county access agreement tied to this parcel. None of them included that road. I stepped out of the truck again and walked the length of the gate line, looking at how naturally the barrier blended into the landscape. From a distance, it looked like it had always been there, not as an interruption, but as a definition. Around 6:10 a.m., I noticed the first official vehicle returning, slower this time, alone, with no line behind it. It stopped short of the gate and remained there without honking or signaling. A man in a county badge stepped out and approached with a folder in his hand. He introduced himself as a liaison sent to verify access compliance. I nodded and handed him a copy of the deed before he could begin his explanation. He studied it quietly, longer than I expected, his attention moving between the recorded survey lines and the physical road in front of him. The realization did not come dramatically. It came gradually, the way it always does when paperwork overrides assumption. Behind him, the morning light grew stronger across the field, revealing how far the land actually stretched beyond what most people ever bothered to consider. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed. He said there would need to be internal review and clarification at the association level. I told him there was no need for urgency on my part, because nothing about ownership had changed overnight. Only perception had. As he walked back to his vehicle, I remained by the gate, understanding that the quiet had shifted again, this time into something closer to anticipation, as if the next response was already being prepared somewhere behind closed doors that no longer controlled what lay beyond them. By 6:38 a.m., the tone of everything around the gate had shifted from confusion to procedure. I could feel it in the way people moved, in how phones stayed pressed to ears longer, in how conversations stopped being emotional and started becoming structured. My name is Caleb Weston, and I had seen this stage before in land disputes, where the first reaction of frustration slowly turns into coordination between people who believe that repeating the same claim in different formats will eventually make it true. The county liaison had left 20 minutes earlier, but I knew his report would not end the situation. It only redirected it. I stood beside the steel gate again, watching the morning light stretch across the empty road, when the next wave arrived in the form of official vehicles and printed documents. 3 SUVs pulled up in sequence, stopping at measured distances as if spacing alone could restore authority. This time, no one stepped out immediately. They waited. That detail told me everything I needed to know. Eventually, the passenger door of the center vehicle opened, and Victoria Hale stepped out. She did not introduce herself at first. She looked at the gate, then at the land beyond it, then at the folder in her hand, as if confirming that the physical world still matched whatever narrative she had built internally. I recognized her from prior county records tied to the Homeowners Association filings, though we had never spoken directly. She approached with controlled steps, stopping just short of the boundary line, and stated that the association was requesting immediate restoration of access under what she called established community precedent. I listened without interrupting. There is a difference between precedent and ownership, and most conflicts like this depend on which one people assume carries more weight. I responded by pointing to the recorded deed again, not raising my voice, not adding interpretation, only reference. She asked to see additional documentation, so I opened the truck and retrieved the full survey archive, including historical plats dating back decades, each one reinforcing the same boundary placement. As she reviewed the pages, I noticed something subtle shift in her posture. It was not acceptance, but recalibration. Behind her, one of the board members began making phone calls, speaking quickly, using phrases like emergency access review and legal clarification window. The language itself was starting to fracture under the weight of evidence. Around 7:05 a.m., a utility maintenance truck arrived and stopped behind the others. The worker inside remained seated, waiting for instruction that never came. I could see how dependent their entire structure was on that single route continuing to function without question. That realization seemed to spread slowly through the group. Victoria finally looked up and asked whether I understood the scale of disruption this would create for residents. I told her I understood perfectly, but understanding impact does not change documented boundaries. For a moment, nobody spoke. Even the wind seemed louder across the open acreage. Then she stepped back slightly, as if physically adjusting to the idea that negotiation would not be based on pressure or urgency. It would have to return to records, surveys, and recorded language. I remained by the gate as they returned to their vehicles one by one, not in defeat, but in reconsideration, and I realized that the conflict had now fully transitioned into its next phase, where belief alone was no longer enough to move anything forward. By 7:42 a.m., the situation had shifted into something far more structured than it had been at sunrise. I could see it in the way vehicles no longer arrived in confusion, but in sequence, each one carrying someone who believed they had a role to restore what they called order. My name is Caleb Weston, and I stood at the gate watching the road remain closed, noticing how quickly certainty breaks down when it has to be defended with paperwork instead of assumption. The earlier voices of frustration had now been replaced by a more deliberate tone, as if repetition and authority titles could collectively override a recorded deed. A new group arrived just after sunrise, including a legal representative carrying a thick binder, followed by two members of the Homeowners Association board who had not been present earlier. They approached without urgency, but with the careful posture of people who believed additional documentation could still resolve what was already finalized in county records. The legal representative introduced himself and immediately referenced easement rights, community necessity, and historical usage patterns. I listened without reacting, letting each argument settle in the air before responding. Then I opened the truck again and retrieved the certified survey file that had been recorded decades earlier, long before the subdivision existed in its current form. I placed it on the hood and allowed them to review it without interruption. The silence that followed was different from the earlier confusion. This silence carried recognition, not acceptance, but the beginning of recalculation. The legal representative slowed his reading as he reached the sections confirming that no formal easement had ever been granted across my property. I could see the moment where professional confidence shifted into procedural caution. Behind him, Victoria Hale spoke quietly with another board member. Their conversation no longer focused on demanding access, but on verifying how their internal records had diverged from public filings. At one point, she asked whether any informal agreement had ever been documented elsewhere, and I told her plainly that informal usage does not create legal access where none was recorded. Around 8:15 a.m., another vehicle arrived carrying a county planning official who had been requested for clarification. He did not engage immediately with either side. Instead, He requested copies of all submitted claims and began cross-referencing them with the county archive. I watched as he compared printed statements from the homeowners association with the original plats, his expression remaining neutral but increasingly focused. After several minutes, he confirmed that the access route in question was not registered as a public or shared corridor under any current county designation. That confirmation changed the dynamic more than any argument had. The board members who had arrived earlier stopped speaking altogether, shifting from assertion to observation. I remained by the gate, not moving it, not changing anything, only observing how the structure of their assumptions was now being replaced by recorded fact. The county official noted that any continued claim of shared access would require formal legal proceedings rather than informal enforcement. No one responded immediately. The wind moved across the open acreage again, carrying dust along the edge of the road, and for the first time that morning, I noticed that no one was attempting to argue over what the land was. They were now focused entirely on what the documents said it had always been. By 9:03 a.m., the energy at the gate had shifted again, but this time it was no longer escalation or debate. It had become something closer to procedural resolution, the kind that happens when every verbal argument has already been replaced by documented authority. I stood in the same position I had held since sunrise, leaning slightly against the steel frame, watching as the county official made a final round of notes in his tablet. My name is Caleb Weston, and I could see that the weight of the situation was no longer resting on opinion or interpretation, but entirely on what had been recorded in public filings for decades. The homeowners association representatives were now standing slightly apart from each other, no longer unified in posture or tone. The legal binder that had once been carried with confidence was now partially closed, resting at the side of the attorney who had arrived earlier. He spoke quietly with Victoria Hale, and for the first time, I noticed the absence of urgency in their conversation. It had been replaced by correction, review, and confirmation. The county official finally approached me directly and asked if I would be willing to confirm the physical boundary markers on site. I agreed without hesitation. We walked the length of the gate line together, past the point where gravel met open field, and I showed him the original survey pins that had been documented in the archived plat records. Each marker corresponded precisely with the coordinates listed in the deed, leaving no ambiguity about the extent of my property. He nodded as he verified each point, occasionally cross-referencing his device with the printed county map. Behind us, the remaining members of the homeowners association stood quietly, no longer attempting to argue, but instead observing the verification process as it unfolded. At one point, Victoria Hale asked whether any form of temporary access agreement could be considered to prevent disruption to residents, but the official responded that such arrangements would require formal negotiation and written consent from the landowner, not assumption or precedent. That statement settled over the group like a final boundary being drawn in real time. I could see the shift in their posture again, this time not from resistance, but from recognition that the structure they had relied on did not extend beyond recorded law. Around 9:40 a.m., the county official completed his review and confirmed in clear terms that the access road in question did not qualify as a shared or public corridor under any existing jurisdictional framework. He stated that any continued use would require a formal easement agreement negotiated directly with me as the property owner. There was no disagreement following that statement, only acknowledgement. One by one, the vehicles that had returned earlier began to reposition, preparing to leave once again, this time without confusion or protest. I remained at the gate as the line slowly dissolved for the second time that morning, watching as the last of them turned back toward the county road. Before leaving, Victoria Hale paused briefly at a distance that no longer carried authority, only reconsideration. She did not argue or object. Instead, she simply asked for clarification on how future access discussions should be initiated through proper channels. I told her they would begin exactly where all land use discussions always begin, with the deed and the recorded boundaries. She nodded once, returned to her vehicle, and closed the door without further comment. As the final car disappeared beyond the bend, the gate remained closed, not as a gesture of defiance, but as a simple reflection of what the records had always shown. The road had not changed. Only understanding had. By 10:26 a.m., The gate stood open again, not because anything had been forced or reversed, but because the process of verification had fully replaced the illusion of ownership conflict. I had remained on site long after the last county vehicle left, watching how quickly people adapt when certainty is removed from the systems they depend on. My name is Caleb Weston, and I stood beside the steel frame of that gate as the morning sun finally cleared the horizon, stretching across 7,200 acres that had been misunderstood for years as empty space instead of recorded property. The air felt different now, not because anything physical had changed, but because the structure of assumption had been corrected by documentation that had always existed but was never consulted. Around 10:40 a.m., a final message arrived on my phone, this time not from a representative or attorney, but from a formal address associated with the Homeowners Association. It was brief, carefully worded, and notably different in tone from earlier communications. There was no demand, no assertion of rights, only a request for formal discussion regarding future access terms. I read it once, then placed the phone back into my pocket without responding immediately. I already knew the answer would not come through urgency or repetition. It would come through process. I walked slowly along the inside of the gate line, looking across the open land where the road disappeared into distance, and thought about how long assumptions can survive when no one challenges them with records. For years, that strip of land had functioned as something between convenience and entitlement for others, a path they used without question because no one had ever required them to ask. Now that structure no longer existed, not because it was taken away, but because it had been defined correctly for the first time. By 11:15 a.m., the last traces of activity had fully cleared from the surrounding area. No vehicles remained, no officials, no lingering presence of negotiation. Only the quiet return of land operating under its actual boundaries. I stood there for a long moment, not celebrating, not reacting, simply observing how resolution feels when it is based entirely on recorded fact rather than resistance. My name is Caleb Weston, and I understood then that the outcome had never depended on confrontation. It had depended on whether the truth in the paperwork would eventually be read. As I turned back toward the truck, the gate remained exactly where it had been since the beginning, unchanged in form, but now understood in full context by everyone who had once driven past it without question. And in that understanding, the entire conflict had already reached its end.